So again, friends, I am talking about Christianity in America. For the purpose of this presentation and for those who might be viewing it at a time other than its actual physical presentation today, I'm Andy C. Luter of the New Life School of Theology. And this presentation actually has been prepared and is being presented to the New Life School of Theology students. This is our monthly webinar. We have come together as we do each and every month. This is a particular presidential presentation that I do with great regularity. And as I have forestated, this is the first of a two-part series that I am doing about Christianity in America. Today's presentation is focused and will revolve around the colonial period of this country, the United States, right up to the Civil War. And what I hope to share with you and intimate to you is that while there is a formal attitude of a separation of church and state in this country that actually developed from its earliest stages of being assembled as a country, that Christianity in particular and the church in particular has always operated in close proximity to one another. And I think that you'll see that in an extraordinary fashion today. I also want to leave time for you to raise questions about the presentation and to examine with you various facets of this narrative and story and give you an opportunity to dialogue about the same. And then, of course, there are some study questions that we want to attach to this presentation that will be due at some point in the future. So, with your permission, let's get started. With roots in the Reformation, who had been there hundreds of years by the time of the founding fathers, that moved from religious tolerance to religious freedom. Now, let me say to you that one of the items that has prompted this presentation, beloved, has been the somewhat awkward behavior of evangelicals in this country during this last election cycle in general, in particular, and over the last few years in general, that there has been a behavior by, more specifically, white evangelicals that defies definition. That on one hand, there is this devout devotion and dedication to a moral standard and posture, and yet there seems to be evidence of hypocrisy or a double standard that is being practiced by white evangelicals in the country. That on one hand, there is a claim to be representatives and ambassadors of Christ and representatives of the church, and yet some of the policies that are embraced are racist, are antagonistic, are misogynist. And so what prompted in part this conversation and this twin presentation that I'm doing is that as I have looked at the behavior, particularly of white evangelicals, I have sought to try and understand how it is you can take a particular political stance on the one hand and then have a moral or a theological stance on the other hand, and the two do not complement each other. They do not reconcile with each other. And I think that what we're going to discover is that as we look at the history of Christianity, watch this, beloved, Christianity in general, but that of evangelicalism in particular, it is a sordid history. And when we go back and take a look at the history, it helps to explain some of the odd and awkward and, I dare say, hypocritical behavior that we're seeing today as it relates to a certain aspect of the church and Christianity. So do understand that this presentation, both today and next month, is really looking at white evangelicals in this country. And it is an attempt to explain and understand behavior that is inconsistent with one another. Now, last week, we had this brilliant presentation about the Black church and Black history. And again, there are some touch points between that presentation and some of the things that I'm going to talk about this month and next month. But this is a slightly different focus. Last week, Dr. Edwards really talked to us about the Black church and Black history. I want to kind of look at the story of white evangelicals in my search to understand this odd and even hypocritical behavior, this inconsistent behavior between a particular aspect and component of the body of Christ here in America. And so the two terms that I want to begin with is that of religious tolerance and that of religious freedom. Now, let me just kind of slow down here a little bit because, and I can assure you that this is going to be part of your study questions, I need you to understand the difference between religious tolerance and religious freedom. And these are terms that have been thrown about as it relates to the founding of America and how this country came to be, but they are not the same. They're not identical. And if we're going to understand this odd behavior of evangelicals in this country, one of the things that we're going to have to grapple with is this different definition between religious tolerance and religious freedom. So let me begin here with religious tolerance. Religious tolerance is the idea that you are willing to allow others who do not share your same beliefs to live in the space where you live. Now, let me kind of go back, and I have shared this with you on other occasions. So for many of you, this is going to be a repeat. The original people who came to America to colonize America, they came with the assumption that the land and the geography that they occupied would belong only to them. So Puritans came to Massachusetts, and they came with the attitude that only Puritans would live in Massachusetts. Dutch Reformed church members came to New York, and their initial assumption was that only people who were a part of the Dutch Reformed Church would live in New York. Quakers came to Pennsylvania, and their assumption was only people who were Quakers would be allowed to live in Pennsylvania. Maryland was filled with Roman Catholics, and so only people who were Roman Catholic were thought to be allowed to live in Maryland. Well, that was the initial thought, and that was the initial attraction. So depending upon what part of the Protestant Reformation you belong to, that determined where you would come. So if you were a Puritan, you went to Massachusetts. If you were an Anabaptist, you went to Rhode Island. If you were Dutch Reformed, you went to New York. If you were Roman Catholic, you went to Maryland. If you were a Quaker, you went to Pennsylvania. Well, over time, there became a more lenient and a wider attitude that maybe we should tolerate those who are living amongst us who do not believe exactly how we believe. So all of a sudden, you have pilgrims coming to Rhode Island and living in the same space where Anabaptists did. And this idea of religious tolerance was this idea that I can tolerate or I can allow people who are not a part of my religious tradition to live in the same physical space where I live. And that was religious tolerance, tolerating people of different beliefs. Now, religious freedom was the antecedent to that. It actually happened before that, because religious freedom was a response to the attitude, primarily in England, that if you did not belong to the Church of England, you were not welcome. If you didn't belong to the Church of England, then your life was at risk, because the attitude of the Church of England was to literally kill and destroy anything that was not part of what it was. And so they labeled these groups that would later come to America as dissidents. Pilgrims were dissidents. Puritans were dissidents. Anabaptists were dissidents. Dutch Reform, dissidents. Roman Catholic, dissidents. Quakers, dissident. And so they literally oppressed people who were not part of the Church of England. So these groups that I just listed, like the Dutch Reform, the Puritans, the Pilgrims, the Quakers, they left England in search of religious freedom, not religious tolerance, but religious freedom. Why? Because they were being persecuted in England for not being a part of the Church of England. What becomes odd, beloved, is that once they get here, they are as oppressive to other groups as they had been by the Church of England. So that's why we start with religious freedom. Religious freedom was the escape from the persecution and the oppression of the Church of England, because these groups were not part of the Church of England. But then when they get here, they have a very rigid and restrictive attitude about not allowing people who are like them to live in the physical space where they are. And over time, there is a relaxation of that attitude. And we go first from religious freedom to the idea that only people who believe like I believe ought to live in the colony where I am. And later on, that is relaxed. There are more lenient attitudes where people from different traditions, different parts of the Reformation are allowed to live where the primary group is living. Now, 1750 is in the middle of the Enlightenment period, that tension between the old lights and the new lights. Now, let me just kind of break this down for you. So from the time that America is colonized up until 1750, this is right in the middle of what we call the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment was a rejection of the church as being the only place where truth can be found. Now, I have done multiple lectures on the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. Names like Voltaire and Rousseau and Thomas Paine, Common Sense, those are the featured thinkers of this particular period. But at the crux, the core, and the foundation of the Age of Enlightenment is this rise, and please get this term down even though I don't have it on the screen. It is epistemology. Epistemology. Epistemology is the belief that an item is not true simply because it is said.
What? I don't, whatever it was, I just heated up. I thought it was chicken.
Mary Bowles.
No, the week before.
We need you. Okay. We need you to reach your microphone. We're listening to your conversation.
I thought it was chicken.
Okay. I don't forgot what I was saying.
Defining episcopology.
Epistemology.
Epistemology. Okay. So epistemology was the belief that an item was true, not because it was simply said, but because there was evidence to support that. It is the foundation of what today, beloved, we call the scientific method, that an item is true because it can be proven to be true. Now, prior to that, an item was true because it was said to be true. And of course, if the church said that it was true, then it was thought to be true without any evidence, because part of the definition of faith was being able to believe in an item without necessarily having proof of that item. So we come up with this Age of Enlightenment, and the Age of Enlightenment, it divides society, beloved. It divides culture, and it divides culture between, and I want you to know these terms, between the old lights and the new lights. Now, the old lights were those who were yet hanging on to this former belief that an item could be true simply because it was said to be true. The new lights were those who were forwarding this new mentality, this new idea that you could only believe a thing to be true if it was proven to be true, or that it rested on the foundation of epistemology. And what started out, watch this, beloved, what started out as an ideological argument ends up becoming a religious argument. It ends up becoming a theological argument. So questions like Christology, ecclesiology, doctrine, salvation, soteriology is now being debated by those of the old lights who are saying, well, the way that I believe one is saved is based upon it is said to be this way. And then the new lights were saying, well, no, I cannot say that I'm saved unless there is evidence that I am saved. There is proof that I am saved. And so what we end up having is this tension between those who are called old lights and new lights. Now, beloved, please get this in your spirit. There are three categories of people in early colonial America. Let me say this again. There are three categories of people in early colonial America. The first of those three are called the supernaturalists. The supernaturalists. They believed in miracles, signs, and wonders, and they were referred to as supernaturalists. The second type of people that we find in early colonial America, and this would greatly impact and influence what groups they decided to belong to. They were the anti-supernaturalists. Now, they believed in practical religion, devoid of superstitions. Now, what they call superstitions, the supernaturalists call signs and wonders. And so this whole idea that the church or pastors or preachers or religious personalities could provide signs and wonders and miracles, that was thought to be superstitious by this second group that's functioning during the early colonial period. So you have the supernaturalists who yet embrace and yet affirm signs, wonders, and miracles and believe in the same. And then you have those who are on the opposite side of the spectrum, and they say that this belief in signs and wonders, because it can't be proven, because it does not reflect epistemology, it is at best superstitious. And those people who believe in signs and wonders and miracles are superstitious individuals who are holding on to a religious belief that is old and no longer relevant. Then you have a third group. Watch this, beloved. You have a third group, and they're called the deists, D-E-I-S-T, the deists. And they are spiritual, but they're not religious. So they believe in, so they don't say God, they would say a supreme being, or they would say deity. I believe in a supreme deity. That's why they're called deists. Now, they do not label themselves with any of the labels of Protestantism. So the deists would not say, I'm a Baptist. They would not say I'm a Congregationalist. They would not say I'm a Pilgrim. They would not say that I'm a Quaker. They would simply say, I believe in a higher being. So they had, and you know people like this even today, they have a God consciousness, but they refrain and they're hesitant to associate or label themselves by a particular religious label. Now, this becomes very, very important, beloved, because individuals like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, they are the leading deists of the day. And one of the things that I'm going to argue and share with you is that America was founded more from the influence of deists than they were supernaturalists or even anti-supernaturalists. So when you look at the individuals who actually write the Declaration of Independence, they're not particular members of a particular church. They believe in a supreme being, and that's why they use the language that they do about deity and supreme being or a higher power, but they do not subscribe to the particular beliefs of a particular denomination. So the three categories that I want you to be familiar with in this presentation are the supernaturalists, the anti-supernaturalists, and then, of course, the deists. Now, major personalities of this period would have included William Penn from the colony at first and later the state of Pennsylvania, Samuel Adams, who would have come from Massachusetts, John Jay in New York, and Thomas Jefferson out of Virginia. And these become the leading voices in a variety of ways. Again, they began as colonies. They would later develop into states, but these were the persons that the people of this era are largely listening to. William Penn, Samuel Adams, John Jay, Thomas Jefferson. And while William Penn is probably exempt from this, you'll notice that the others are integral parts of not only the construct of the Declaration of Independence, but the war for independence from Great Britain as well. So let's take a moment to look at the founding documents of the period, include the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. These three, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and the Bill of Rights. Now, let me just say about the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution of the United States, that is the founding document of this period, is the second document of this type, because the original document is known as the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, that is the antecedent to the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution, 1791, is written later, and it is written only when the colonies and now states come to the conclusion that their Articles of Confederation is too weak to hold the country together. Let me just kind of share this with you. As these colonies, newly founded states, come out of the War of Independence, there is a great debt that they yet owe France that had helped them financially in their fight against Great Britain. And originally, the Articles of Confederation gave the ultimate power to the states. The states, so, you know, it was almost as though each state was its own country. So you had the state of Massachusetts, the state of Virginia, the state of Pennsylvania. And originally, according to the Articles of Confederation, each of those were an independent state, independent of one another. Articles of Confederation allowed them to function as an independent state. Well, as independent states, collectively, they were not able to pay off this debt to France. And so they rapidly came to the conclusion, as a result of an event called Shays' Rebellion, that they needed to consolidate their power and operate as a single country as opposed to 13 independent countries. Now, this politically, beloved, this politically is the bedrock of what you hear today as states' rights. Roe versus Wade. The reversal of Roe versus Wade was that the Supreme Court said that the matter of abortion is not to be decided on a federal level, but that every individual state has the right to define what its attitude about abortion would be. So anytime you hear about states' rights, a flag really should go up in our mind, because when the southern states wanted to hold on to slavery, it was their definition of states' rights that was the premise of their succession from the Union, from the United States. I know I'm kind of going in a number of different directions here, but and that's why they call themselves the Confederacy, because they were going back to the Articles of Confederation that gave states more power than the federal government. According to the Articles of Confederation, a state governor had more power than the president of the United States. Now, that is no longer the case, and we shifted from the Articles of Confederation to the United States Constitution. And the United States Constitution is part of this three-pronged founding documents of this country. But what I want to argue in your hearing is that the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, and the Bill of Rights are documents that grow out of this age of enlightenment, this new way of thinking. And that new way of thinking is reflected in these documents that become the early documents and the founding documents of the United States. Now, the other great influence during this colonial era or Christianity in America is the First Great Awakening. I have done multiple presentations on this, so I don't need to spend a lot of time on this. But I do want to remind you, those of you who have listened to me before, who the pivotal personalities are during this First Great Awakening. They include John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards. John Wesley and George Whitefield were classmates at Oxford University in England. They belonged to a group that was called the Holiness Club. And of course, Jonathan Edwards was a Presbyterian minister who came primarily to the state of New Jersey and had a strong voice. But these three are the major voices that make up the First Great Awakening. First Great Awakening lasted from 1740 to 1770. 1740 to 1770. If I say it a third time, you'll know it's going to be one of your study questions. 1740 to 1770, the First Great Awakening. Now, the First Great Awakening contained three items that I want you to be familiar with. Number one, the origin of fundamentalism, the origin of fundamentalism. Later on, and remember, my premise is to help us understand why is there this inconsistent behavior among evangelicals. Well, the evangelicals are descendants. They are the spiritual and the ideological descendants of fundamentalists, or the fundamentalists or fundamentalism. Fundamentalism, which would later morph into evangelicalism in this country, was founded in the First Great Awakening. The very root of who would initially be fundamentalists and later become evangelicals takes place during the First Great Awakening. And so the origin of fundamentalism here, and then it provides the First Great Awakening, its mindset, its way of thinking, its mentality, is the context of the American Revolution. What I'm saying is one of the byproducts of the First Great Awakening was that colonists, for the first time, began to see themselves not as citizens of Massachusetts or Pennsylvania or Maryland. Colonists, for the first time, because of the First Great Awakening, saw themselves as Americans. They saw themselves as one people as opposed to different people who live in different parts of the country. That's very, very important, because the colonies would not have successfully been able to separate and fight off the British if they continued to think of themselves as individual colonists. It wasn't Virginia and Maryland and Massachusetts individually that was fighting Great Britain. No, it was Americans that were fighting Great Britain, and that they erased or blurred these colonial lines, saw themselves as a single people who were united under the cause of separating or declaring their independence from Great Britain. And then the other item, the third item that is a byproduct of, and you're going to love this, beloved, a byproduct of the First Great Awakening is the rise of emotional revivalism. Now, that's very, very important, because that becomes a trademark and a characteristic of how Blacks decide to worship and have church in this country. One of the things that Dr. Edwards talked to us about was this tension between Blacks in the South who are emotional and animated with their worship, compared to Blacks in the North who were a little more sedate, a little more sophisticated, a little quieter in their worship, because they were trying to imitate a mainstream culture that had rejected old lights, new lights, that had rejected animated, emotional worship style. And so as the Southern Blacks came from the South and brought the way they had church to the North, there was this tension. There was a conflict between the way you had church in the North and the way you had church in the South. Well, all of that in the Black community is a reflection of the same kind of schism and divide that's taking place in the white community amongst evangelicals and your mainstream denominations. So the First Great Awakening also includes this rise of emotional revivalism, that there were these revivals where you danced and you clapped hands and you shouted and you said amen. In contrast to going to church, sitting quiet, listening to a sermon where the preacher did not raise his voice. It was an ideological argument. It was a philosophical argument, but it did not require the investment of your emotional self. Here is a wider secular sociological context for colonial America. Prosperity via tobacco, sugar, and cotton, which is the reason why slavery became so prominent and popular in this country, because it helped to harvest these crop items that led to the prosperity of America. Cheap labor due to slavery, religiously stagnant due to the age of enlightenment, beginning of an American melting pot. Denominational labels become less important. Now, let me just kind of go back through this. Again, tobacco, sugar, and cotton were the chief products that were exported by America, and that's what made America rich. The harvesting, the planting, and the harvesting of tobacco, sugar, and then, of course, later on, cotton, as Dr. Edwards talked to us about last week. And of course, this was prosperous because it could be harvested with cheap labor. Slavery made it an extremely economic boost to America because they could plant and harvest these items on the backs of cheap labor. And because of the popularity of the Age of Enlightenment and the need for epistemology and the proof that a thing was true, religion became stagnant. Because remember, religion was based upon your faith, not needing to have epistemology. Well, the more that the Age of Enlightenment grew, the less popular did religion or Christianity in general become. And then, of course, there's this developing idea of religious tolerance, where people from different parts of the country who have different beliefs, beloved, are now moving to other colonies, and they're being tolerated in those colonies, which is resulting in America becoming a melting pot. So no longer do you have just Puritans in Massachusetts and just Roman Catholics in Maryland. You have all kinds of people moving to all kinds of places. And this begins to define America as a melting pot. And watch this, and this is going to make so much sense to you, as America becomes a melting pot, denominational labels become less important. So it's no longer as important, your label, I'm a Baptist, Dutch Reformed, a Puritan, I'm a Presbyterian, I am a Quaker. These denominational labels become less important. And we see the remnant of that today, where people say, well, you know, I go to an interdenominational church, or I go to a non-denominational church. There's this appeal to somehow do away with denominational labels and to emphasize and to draw more attention to just being a Christian without denominational labels. And of course, part of our rhetoric grows up and we say, you know, when we get to heaven, we're not going to be Baptist, we're not going to be Apostolic, we're not going to be Pentecostal, we're just going to be children of God. Well, the origin of that argument actually begins during this colonial era, when denominational tags and labels become less important. Why do they become less important? Because these great revivals, that's a trademark and a characteristic of the First Great Awakening. Remember John Wesley, George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, these great outdoor meetings, beloved, that they have were interdenomination that were held primarily on the Eastern Seaboard. So what I'm saying is that you went to your church, your denominational church on Sunday, but when you went to a revival, it wasn't a Baptist revival, it wasn't a Presbyterian revival, it wasn't a Roman Catholic revival, it was just a revival. It was just part of the First Great Awakening. So these revival movements, these great outdoor meetings, did not have denominational tags, which meant that anybody and everybody from whatever church they came from were welcome at these outdoor events that became the bedrock of the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening, they weren't non-denominational, they were interdenominational, which meant that Presbyterians and Catholics and Baptists were all welcome and felt comfortable being in the same religious setting. Then we have the American Revolution, which is, get this, beloved, 1775 to 1783. Colonies felt capable of self-government and less dependent upon Great Britain. The Quebec Act of 1774 created an outpost for Roman Catholicism. I already mentioned to you that Maryland was an outpost of Roman Catholicism here in America. But 2 years, get this, beloved, 2 years prior to our American Revolution, or actually 1 year, if you take the date of 1775 as the commencement of the American Revolution, there is this Act of Quebec where the Church of England carves out this space in Canada where Roman Catholics are encouraged to go to. What's important here is that these groups of people came to New York, came to Massachusetts, came to Pennsylvania, relying and depending upon Great Britain from their survival. By the time we get to the 18th century, 1775, these same people who came here believing that they were reliant and dependent upon Great Britain, they had this idea, partly because of the Age of Enlightenment and partly because of the First Great Awakening. There grows this idea, you know what? We don't need Great Britain to govern us. We can govern ourselves. And what fuels the American Revolution is this idea that is a byproduct of the Age of Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening, that we can govern ourselves. It's almost like a child that gets to a point and say, you know, I don't have to stay in mama's house and abide by mama and daddy's rules. I can go get my own apartment and live my life the way that I want to live. Now, I know I'm using that metaphorically, but all of you who are parents, you have gone through that. You know, where you say, if you stay in my house, these are my rules. When you get to the point where you don't want to abide by my rules, then you get your own house. Well, that's kind of how these American colonies had grown up. For a long time, they had a childlike attitude and mentality about Great Britain. But by 1775, they're grown, or they're feeling that they're grown and that they can operate on their own. Now, here are some common American attitudes that I want you to be aware of. Number one, the world has fallen, but America is a chosen nation by God. The world has fallen. That's the old world, the old lights. That is Europe, all right? The belief is that world is going to hell in a basket. But God has created America to be a chosen nation, and we are the new chosen people of God. Number two, churches subscribe to an American spirit. There is this rise and this equivocation between patriotism and Christianity, that the more you are a patriot, the greater the Christian you are. And of course, we see remnants of that in the whole MAGA movement, where when it talks about making America great again, it's talking about making America at the time, what it was at the time when it was ideologically, politically, but also religiously, quote unquote, great. America uses religion to justify their politics. Get this, beloved, see this? That the other attitude that grows out of this colonial period is that America uses religion to justify their politics. Post-revolution Methodists rush to French wilderness to spread the gospel. What am I saying? I'm saying that after the American Revolution, primarily it was the Methodist Church, because we had purchased this Louisiana Purchase that went from New Orleans all the way to the West Coast. And who is it? It is the Methodists initially who rushed to this area of the Louisiana Purchase, not to spread America. Get this, beloved, not to expand America, but to expand Christianity. Christianity becomes the reason that this Louisiana territory is populated and colonized with Americans, not so that America can expand, but so that Christianity can be spread from New Orleans all the way to the West Coast. Francis Asbury, Thomas Coke, and Harry Hoosier are chiefly responsible for this expansion. And all of these individuals, beloved, Francis Asbury, Thomas Coke, and Harry Hoosier, who was also called Black Harry, he was an African American. They are Methodist members of the Methodist Church who go into the newly acquired area of America after the American Revolution. Again, not to spread America, but to spread Christianity. This becomes the origin of the circuit rider, those who go around the wilderness. It was called the wilderness then because it had not yet become a colony. It had not yet become a state, but it was the target destination of those who wanted to spread Christianity. Now, here are the touch points between what I'm talking about today and what Dr. Edwards shared with you on last week. Slaves were not initially evangelized. There was the creation of a slave Bible that removed, get this, Exodus. Why? Because that was the story of slaves leaving Egypt. Philemon, why? Because that was the story of a Christian treating a slave like an equal. And then the story of Galatians 3. Why was Galatians 3 removed? Because in Galatians 3, it says that in Christianity, there is no bond, no free, no slave, no master, no male, no female. And that did not serve the purposes of those who were promoting slavery in the South. Slaves attended their master's church. In 1814, Richard Allen, Dr. Edwards talked extensively about this last week. The African Methodist Episcopal Church becomes a freedom church, and it becomes an outpost and an advocate for freedom for slaves in this country. And abolitionists grew out of moral reform movement of the Second Great Awakening. Now, I told you that the First Great Awakening was 1740 to 1770. The Second Great Awakening is from 1820 to 1840. And these abolitionists, these people, watch this, beloved, watch this, these people who advocate the abolition of slavery in this country are those who come out of the Second Revival movement of 1820 to 1840. And they are under the moral conviction that if I'm going to be a true Christian and if I'm going to believe this Bible, then there's no way that I can hold slaves. There's no way that I can approve of slavery and yet be a Christian based upon what I'm being told and taught and preached to in this revival movement known as the Second Great Awakening. So, here are the pivotal figures of the Civil War. Remember that my presentation today goes from the colonial era up to the Civil War. Frederick Douglass, who becomes an outspoken critic of white Christianity. John Brown, again, a product of the Second Great Awakening, who comes out of the Second Great Awakening and feels that it is his call of God to take up arms and to literally, physically, and violently free slaves from their slave master. We have William Lloyd Garrison, who creates this newspaper, the Spectator newspaper, which is an abolitionist newspaper. We have Harriet Beecher Stowe, who writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, which raises the consciousness of the plight of Black people in this country and contributes greatly to the abolitionist movement. And then I know I'm kind of Julia Ward Howe, who writes the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which becomes the signature song for Abraham Lincoln, who is leading the country in this Civil War, in part to do away with slavery, but also in part to keep the country together. Here are my closing thoughts before I open the floor for your commentary and your questions. Both Union and Confederate armies held revivals between their fighting of each other. When they weren't fighting, this is going to blow your mind. When they weren't fighting each other, they were in these worship services. They were having these revival meetings. Why? Because both the North and the South operated under the assumption that they were doing the work of God. The North operated under the religious assumption that they were doing the work of God in destroying slavery. And the South had this alternative belief that they were doing the work of God by holding on to slavery. Chaplains, beloved, chaplains were used for the first time during the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, you did not have chaplains or religious personalities who were a part of the military makeup. It is the Civil War that brings chaplains into service as a part of the military. And here's the other thing that I think that you're going to find both compelling and interesting. I know that he is regarded as the great emancipator, and a number of denominations have celebrated Abraham Lincoln, but Abraham Lincoln himself was a Calvinized deist who never joined a church. Remember, I told you what a deist was. Calvinist Presbyterian. So he believed in eternal security. He believed in the fundamentals of once saved, always saved, but he was a deist. He believed in a higher power. He believed in a supreme being, and he never joined a local church. So it's kind of hard for organized religion to lay claim to Abraham Lincoln as a source of inspiration and encouragement, because Abraham Lincoln himself chose, for a variety of reasons, not to belong to any particular church. He wasn't a Baptist, he wasn't a Presbyterian, he wasn't an Episcopalian. He believed in a higher being, but he also was a nonconformist who did not subscribe to church membership. So that takes up all of my time. This has been Christianity in America, the colonial period to the Civil War. I'm anxious to hear your thoughts, your comments, the questions that you might have. I will raise my study questions in just a few moments. And then next month, we're going to come back and look at just after the Civil War up to the modern church. Your thoughts, your questions, your remarks, and then questions for this era. Anybody?
I'll start, Bishop. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Wonderful presentation. Let me start out by saying I really couldn't wrap my mind around what evangelicals thought, like you just said. But after I took your 2 courses on fundamentalism and evangelicalism, sort of got a better understanding of where they were coming from. Not that I agreed with them, but I got a better understanding. I like to think of them as Pharisees or Sadducees. Do as I say, not as I do. And that's the only way I could really deal with, you know, what comes out of their mouth or any of their statements. That's it in a nutshell. They're Sadducees and Pharisees.
Okay.
But again, a great presentation. Definitely tying in a lot of fifth-year courses. I wish I would have had this before fifth year, but I definitely enjoyed the presentation.
Bless you. Good analysis. Good analysis about Pharisees and Sadducees. Anybody else?
Excellent presentation, Bishop. You know, it's funny because when you got into the religious aspect of why they do what they do, I have never looked at these televangelists that way. I've always looked at them as people who are only interested in how much money they can get people to give them. So I've never, when I've listened to their message, it's all like Joel Osteen is always about, you know, how much money you can get when you send him money. So I've never looked at it from a religious point of view, but this was an excellent presentation. So I might have to actually watch one again and listen to what they're actually saying.
Okay, okay. Anybody else?
Excellent, Bishop.
Okay. Yes, Elder.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I got an email the other day and I threw it in the trash. I'm gonna have to go find it because it said, why is Exodus not really in the Bible? And then you talked about the slave Bible, that it was removed. Because I was like, oh, this is garbage. I'm not reading that. You know, they continue stuff. So now I got to go find it because I didn't know that. So that would make sense. And then how, you know, now I can look at the evangelicals at the way you're saying it. It makes sense why they act the way they do. So thanks a lot. I appreciate that.
Great, great.
Excellent presentation, Bishop. I'm looking forward to the questions.
Yes, excellent presentation, Bishop. When we went to the African American Museum in DC, they actually had a copy of the slave Bible, and they showed what pieces were missing and what parts of the actual Bible were taken out. So it was just ironic.
Indeed.
Good morning, Bishop.
Good morning.
Man, once again, you know how to blow our mind, don't you? I'm dumbfounded at the fact that we can all read the same Bible, yet the South believed that what they was doing was the Lord's work, and while the North believed what they was doing was the Lord's work. And in the midst of them fighting, they're having worship experiences. That just defies logic and blows my mind. But thank you again, Bishop.
Wow.
For
okay.
answering so many questions.
Great.
Sounds like today.
Yes, it does.
Exactly.
Well, listen, beloved, I've got to get to a health and wellness workshop, but let me give you 10 questions. Question number 1. What do we call the movement that sought to escape persecution by the Church of England? What do we call the movement that sought to escape the persecution of the Church of England? Number 2, what was the belief that people of different denominations could live in the same physical space? What do we call the attitude or the movement that believed that people who had different beliefs could live in the same space? Number 3, what were the 2 groups that were called in 1750 that was a result of the Age of Enlightenment? Name the 2 groups that were labeled because of the Age of Enlightenment in 1750. This is number 3 or 4?
This is 4 coming up.
4. Number 4. Name the 3 categories of people in colonial America. Name the 3 categories of people in colonial America. 5. Name the 4 people who were the major personalities of this colonial period. Name the 4 people who were the major personalities of this colonial period. I'm gonna give you a hint. 1 was from Pennsylvania, 1 was from Massachusetts, 1 was from New York, and the other was from Virginia. Name the 4 major personalities of this colonial era. 1 was from Pennsylvania, 1 was from Massachusetts, 1 was from New York, and the other was from Virginia. Six, name the 3 founding documents of the colonial era. Name the 3 founding documents of the colonial era. Seven, who were the leading preachers of the First Great Awakening? Who were the leading preachers of the First Great Awakening? Eight, what movement is the origin of the fundamentalists? What movement is the origin of the fundamentalists? Nine. I gave you 5 pivotal figures of the Civil War. I gave you 5 pivotal figures of the Civil War. Give me those 5 individuals. And 10, in what war were chaplains used for the first time? In what war were chaplains used for the first time? Any questions on the questions? And Dean Dowdy, this will be due when?
This will be due next December's presidential election. It's always due the following month, same week. December 17th to be exact.
All right. We're praying for Prophet Michael Luda. I see in the chat room that his mother's, I think this must be his mother's oldest aunt just passed away at 100 years old. We're keeping them in prayer.
Amen.
Yeah. Okay, beloved. If there is nothing else, I charge you to go in peace, joy, love, and happiness, for the author of the same goes with you.